The silent tears streaming down Nora Bennett's face caught the light of the setting sun as she sat alone in the meadow, her white wedding dress billowing around her like a cloud against the tall prairie grass of Wyoming Territory. 1878. The ceremony that was supposed to have taken place 3 hours ago at the little white church in Willow Creek had never happened. Her groom had never arrived. Nora clutched the piece of paper that had been delivered by the sheriff himself just as she was preparing to walk down the aisle. Jonathan Harrington, her fiancé of 2 years, had written that he couldn't go through with it. He'd taken the stage east that morning, returning to Boston and the wealthy family that had never approved of his frontier adventure or his choice of bride. She had fled the whispers and pitying glances, running until her satin slippers were stained with dirt and grass, finding solace in this wildflower meadow on the edge of the Bradshaw property. Her father's ranch bordered the meadow to the east, but she couldn't bear to return home and face everyone's sympathy. "Miss." A deep voice startled her from her misery. Nora looked up, quickly wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. Standing a few yards away was Owen Lawson, his tall form silhouetted against the orange and pink sky. She recognized him as the new foreman from the neighboring Diamond L Ranch, a man she'd seen in town but rarely spoken to. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, removing his hat and revealing sun-streaked brown hair. "I saw someone sitting out here from the ridge and wanted to make sure everything was all right." Nora attempted to smooth her crumpled dress. "As you can see, Mr. Lawson, everything is perfectly fine," she replied, her voice breaking on the last word, betraying her. Owen stepped closer, and she noticed the bunch of wildflowers in his hand, purple lupines, bright yellow sunflowers, and delicate white daisies he must have been gathering. His expression was kind but uncertain, a man clearly navigating unfamiliar territory. "I heard about what happened in town," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." A fresh wave of humiliation washed over her. News travels fast. "It's a small place," Owen acknowledged. He hesitated, then gestured to the ground beside her. "May I?" Nora nodded, too exhausted to maintain proper decorum. He sat down, keeping a respectful distance, and laid his hat on the grass between them. "These were for my cabin," he said, looking at the flowers in his hand. "But I reckon they do more good with you." He offered them to her awkwardly. Something about his simple kindness broke through her carefully constructed composure. She accepted the flowers, clutching them to her chest as fresh tears spilled. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat in silence as the sun continued its descent behind the distant mountains. Owen didn't offer platitudes or advice, for which Nora was grateful. He simply kept her company in her moment of deepest pain. "My mother always said that the worst moments show us who really loves us," Owen finally said. "Those who stay when it would be easier to go." Nora looked at him then, really seeing him for the first time. His face was tanned from working outdoors, with laugh lines around eyes that were a surprisingly gentle blue. She'd heard he'd come west from Missouri about 6 months ago, after the war had taken much of his family. "And who stayed for you, Mr. Lawson?" she asked quietly. A sad smile touched his lips. "Not many, but enough to teach me the value of being that person for someone else." As darkness fell, Owen insisted on escorting Nora home. He helped her to her feet and draped his jacket around her shoulders when the evening chill set in. They walked slowly toward her father's ranch house, the wildflowers still clutched in her hand. "Everyone will be worried," she said, dreading the moment she would have to face her family. "Then they'll be relieved when you return," Owen replied. "And tomorrow things won't seem quite as dark." When they reached the gate of the Bennett Ranch, light spilled from every window of the house. Nora could see figures moving inside her parents, her younger sister, probably neighbors and friends who had come to offer comfort. "I can't," she whispered, freezing in place. "I can't face them." Owen stepped in front of her, blocking her view of the house. "You can," he said firmly, "because you're stronger than you know, Miss Bennett, and because you won't be alone." In that moment, with his steady presence beside her, Nora believed him. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and nodded. "Will you walk me to the door, Mr. Lawson?" "Owen," he corrected her. "And I would be honored." It was only as they approached the house that Nora realized she still wore his jacket, still clutched the wildflowers he had picked. The simple gifts of a man who had been a stranger that morning, but who had shown more kindness than the man she'd planned to marry. Her father opened the door before they reached it, relief washing over his weathered face. "Nora, thank God," he said, rushing to embrace her. Over her father's shoulder she saw her mother approaching, her eyes red from crying. "Mr. Bennett," Owen said, stepping back respectfully. "I found your daughter taking in the sunset. I hope you don't mind that I escorted her home." George Bennett released his daughter and turned to the cowboy, extending his hand. "Thank you, Lawson. We've been worried sick." "It's nothing, sir," Owen replied, shaking his hand firmly. Nora slipped off his jacket and handed it back to him. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning for far more than the walk home. Owen nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Good night, Miss Bennett." As he turned to leave, Nora felt a strange reluctance to see him go. "Mr. Lawson," she called after him. When he turned back, she said, "The wildflowers around Willow Creek are particularly beautiful this time of year. I often walk by the creek on Sunday afternoons." A smile spread slowly across his face, transforming his serious expression. "Is that so? I might have to see these wildflowers for myself someday." "Sunday," she repeated softly, surprising herself with her boldness. "Sunday," he agreed, putting his hat back on and tipping it slightly before walking away into the darkness. 2 days later, Nora stood by the creek, her plain blue cotton dress a stark contrast to the wedding gown she'd last worn. She'd come early, half convinced Owen wouldn't appear, telling herself she was simply enjoying the sunshine and fresh air after being coddled by her family since the wedding disaster. She had just convinced herself to return home when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Owen rode up on a chestnut gelding, dressed in clean denims and a pressed shirt. He dismounted smoothly, tying his horse to a nearby tree. "Miss Bennett," he greeted her, approaching with his hat in his hands. "I was hoping you'd be here." "I wasn't sure you'd remember," she admitted. "I remember everything about that evening," he replied simply. They walked along the creek, talking with increasing ease. Owen told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, losing 2 brothers in the war and coming west to escape the memories and make something of himself. "Diamond L is a good outfit," he said. "Mr. Lawson no relation, just coincidence gave me a chance when I showed up with nothing but my horse and saddle. Started as a regular hand, worked my way up to foreman." "That's impressive," Nora said, genuinely admiring his determination. "What about you? Have you always lived in Willow Creek?" Owen asked. Nora nodded. "Born and raised. My father came out here when Wyoming was barely settled, built the ranch from nothing." She hesitated, then added, "Jonathan, my former fiancé, he was from Boston. Came west to experience the frontier before settling down to his family's banking business." "And you were part of the frontier experience?" Owen asked carefully. Nora gave a bitter laugh. "Apparently. Something to tell his grandchildren about someday, I suppose." "The Western girl he almost married." Owen stopped walking and turned to face her. "Some men don't recognize true value when they see it, Miss Bennett." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Nora," she corrected him softly. "Please call me Nora." "Nora," he repeated, her name sounding different in his deep voice. That Sunday by the creek marked the beginning. Owen began calling at the Bennett ranch, facing the scrutiny of Nora's protective father and the gossip of the town. People whispered that Nora was rebounding, that it wasn't proper for her to be entertaining another suitor so soon after being jilted. But Owen wasn't deterred by the talk. Every Sunday, they would meet by the creek. Sometimes they would ride together across the rolling Wyoming landscape, exploring hidden valleys and breathtaking vistas. Other times, they would simply sit and talk, getting to know each other in the patient way of 2 people with no need to rush. As summer deepened, so did their connection. Owen would bring her wildflowers each time they met, continuing what had begun that first evening in the meadow. "You'll run out of flowers eventually," Nora teased one afternoon in late July as he presented her with a particularly lovely bunch of Indian paintbrush. "Not possible," he replied with a smile. "Wyoming grows them faster than I can pick them, and even if they didn't, I'd find something else to bring you." The simple sincerity of his words touched her more deeply than any flowery declaration from Jonathan ever had. One evening, as a summer storm gathered on the horizon, they took shelter in an abandoned line shack on the border between their properties. Rain pounded the roof as they sat side by side on a rough wooden bench, watching the storm through the open doorway. "I used to be afraid of storms," Nora admitted, watching lightning crack across the darkened sky. "When I was little, my mother would hold me and sing until I fell asleep." Owen's hand found hers, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "What about now?" "Now I find them beautiful," she said, turning to look at him. "Powerful, unpredictable, but beautiful." His eyes held hers, and the air between them seemed to crackle with the same electricity as the storm. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Owen leaned forward. Their first kiss was gentle, questioning, a whisper of possibility rather than a demand. When they broke apart, Nora felt breathless as though she'd been running. "I wasn't expecting that," she whispered. "I've wanted to do that since the first day by the creek," Owen admitted. "But I didn't want you to think I was taking advantage. And now I'm hoping you might feel the same way I do." Nora looked at this man who had come into her life when she was at her lowest, who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. "I think I might," she said softly and leaned in to kiss him again. The storm eventually passed, but the change between them remained. As they rode back to her father's ranch, Nora felt lighter than she had in months, perhaps years. At the Bennett gate, Owen turned to her with serious eyes. "I'd like to speak with your father." Nora's heart skipped. "About courting you properly, with his blessing." Despite everything they'd shared that afternoon, Nora hesitated. "Owen, I don't know if I'm ready to think about that sort of future again." "It's only been a few months since. I'm not proposing marriage," he assured her quickly. "Not yet. I'm just asking for the chance to court you openly, without sneaking around like we've something to hide. I respect your father, and I respect you too much for anything less." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Nora's chest. "Oh, then yes, I think that would be fine." George Bennett was skeptical but fair. He invited Owen into his study and closed the door, leaving Nora to pace the parlor nervously with her mother. "He seems a good man," Margaret Bennett said, watching her daughter. "Steady, reliable, he is," Nora agreed, "different from Jonathan." Nora stopped pacing. "Yes, very different." Her mother studied her face carefully. "You care for him." It wasn't a question, but Nora answered anyway. "I do." "It's happened so quickly, but I do." "The heart knows what it wants, regardless of timing," Margaret said wisely. "Your father and I met and married within 3 months, and you've been happy," her mother smiled. 30 years next spring, not always easy, but always worth it." When the men emerged from the study, both wore expressions that revealed nothing. Owen thanked the Bennetts for their hospitality and bid Nora a formal goodnight, promising to call again soon. Only after he'd gone did her father say, "That's a man who knows his own mind. Says he intends to have his own spread someday, not work for another man forever." "What did you tell him?" Nora asked. "That if his intentions remain honorable and you're amenable, I have no objections to his calling on you." George Bennett's stern expression softened. "And that if he ever causes you a moment's pain like that city boy did, he'll answer to me." As summer gave way to fall, Owen and Nora's courtship became the subject of less gossip and more genuine well-wishes. He proved himself a man of integrity, working hard at Diamond L during the week and devoting his Sundays to Nora. In October, he took her to see a piece of land he was considering purchasing, a smaller spread adjacent to Diamond L, with good water access and pasture for a modest herd. "What do you think?" he asked as they stood on a ridge overlooking the property. "Could someone build a life here?" Nora looked around, seeing not what was there but what could be a house nestled against the hillside, cattle grazing in the valley, children playing by the creek. "I think it has everything essential," she replied carefully. Owen turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Nora, I know it hasn't been that long since we met, and I promised your father I wouldn't rush you, but I need you to know that I'm building this future with you in mind." Her heart raced. "Owen, I'm not asking yet," he assured her. "I'm just telling you that when I imagine my life on this land, you're always part of that vision." Tears pricked at her eyes. "I see it too," she admitted. "When I look at this place, I can see us here." The smile that lit his face was worth every moment of pain she'd endured with Jonathan. Owen pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as they looked out over what might someday be their home. "I love you, Nora Bennett," he said against her hair. "I think I have since that day in the meadow." She leaned back to look up at him, her heart so full it might burst. "I love you too." Winter came early that year, with heavy snows isolating the ranches around Willow Creek. Owen's visits became less frequent as travel grew more difficult. But when he did make it through, he stayed longer, often spending the entire day with the Bennett family before braving the journey back to Diamond L. At Christmas, he presented Nora with a hand-carved wooden box filled with pressed wildflowers, specimens of every flower he'd given her since their first meeting. "So you'll have flowers even in winter," he explained as she traced the delicate petals through the protective wax paper. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touched by the hours of work the gift represented. In return, she gave him a new leather-bound journal, having noticed his habit of writing in the evenings. "For your thoughts," she said, "when we can't be together." That evening, as Owen prepared to leave despite the threatening snow, George Bennett surprised them both. "You'll stay the night, Lawson. There's a bed made up in the spare room. No sense risking your neck in this weather." Owen glanced at Nora, who nodded encouragingly. "Thank you, sir." "I'd be grateful." That night became the first of many where Owen was welcomed as family rather than a guest. By February, with winter still holding the territory in its grip, he had a standing invitation to stay whenever the weather turned. It was during one such night in early March, with a late-season blizzard howling outside, that Owen finally broached the subject they'd been circling for months. The Bennett family had retired early, leaving Owen and Nora alone in the parlor with only the crackling fire for company. They sat side by side on the sofa, Nora reading aloud from a novel while Owen listened contentedly. When she finished the chapter, he took the book gently from her hands and set it aside. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I've been carrying this around for weeks," he admitted, waiting for the right moment. "But I'm beginning to think there is no perfect moment except the one you make yourself." Nora's breath caught as he opened the pouch and tipped a ring onto his palm, a simple gold band with a small pearl set between two tiny sapphires. "It was my mother's," he explained. "One of the few things I kept when I came west. I've been saving it for the woman I wanted to spend my life with." He slid from the sofa onto one knee before her, holding the ring up. "Nora Bennett, I love you more than I thought possible. Will you marry me and build that life we talked about, the house on the hillside, the cattle in the valley, and, God willing, children by the creek?" Tears of joy spilled onto her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she managed through the emotion tightening her throat. "Yes, Owen, I will marry you." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand. Owen rose to sit beside her again, drawing her into a deep kiss that held all the promises of their future together. When they finally broke apart, Nora rested her forehead against his. "I was so afraid after Jonathan that I'd never trust anyone enough to try again." "I'll spend every day making sure you never regret taking that chance," Owen vowed. They were married in May, when the wildflowers once again carpeted the meadows around Willow Creek. Unlike her first almost wedding, this ceremony was small and intimate, held outdoors near the creek where they'd spent so many Sunday afternoons. Nora wore a simple dress of ivory satin, with wildflowers woven into her dark hair instead of a veil. Owen stood tall and proud in a new suit, looking at her with such naked adoration that several of the guests were moved to tears. After the ceremony and celebration, Owen drove a wagon loaded with their belongings to their new home, the property he'd shown her in the fall, now officially theirs. He had worked through the winter whenever weather permitted, building a small but sturdy cabin that would serve until they could afford a proper house. As they approached, Nora gasped. Surrounding the cabin was a sea of wildflowers, not natural, but planted in careful rows. "I started them from seeds in February," Owen explained, watching her reaction. "Had them growing in the bunkhouse window at Diamond L, planted them last month while you were busy with wedding preparations." "Our own wildflower meadow," Nora whispered, overwhelmed by the gesture. When they reached the cabin, Owen surprised her by lifting her into his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lawson," he said, carrying her across the threshold. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, sturdy furniture Owen had crafted himself, and windows that looked out over their land. On the table sat a vase filled with fresh-picked wildflowers. "It's perfect," Nora said, turning in a circle to take it all in. "Absolutely perfect." That night, as they lay together in the quiet of their new home, Owen traced gentle patterns on Nora's bare shoulder. "Happy?" he asked softly. "More than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "A year ago, I thought my life was over. Now I realize it was just beginning." "I felt the same way when I came west," Owen admitted. "Like I was running from a past I couldn't change, but now I know I was running toward you all along." In the years that followed, the small cabin grew into the house Nora had envisioned on the hillside. Their modest herd expanded, making Rocking L Ranch, named for the shape of the creek that bounded their property, one of the most successful smaller operations in the territory. 3 children eventually played by that creek: twin boys, George and Samuel, born in their second year of marriage, and a daughter, Margaret, who arrived 2 years later. All 3 inherited their father's blue eyes and their mother's quiet strength. Each spring, Owen continued the tradition of planting wildflowers around their home, adding new varieties as they became available. And each year on their anniversary, they would walk together to the meadow where they had first met, where a bride had sat alone in her ruined wedding dress, and a cowboy had picked flowers and her heart together. On their 10th anniversary, they made this pilgrimage as usual, but this time with their children racing ahead through the tall grass. "Do you ever wonder what happened to Jonathan?" Owen asked as they watched the children play. Nora shook her head. "Not anymore. I heard he married a banker's daughter in Boston and never returned west, but his leaving was the best thing that ever happened to me." She squeezed Owen's hand. "It led me to you." Owen pulled her close, kissing her with the same tenderness he'd shown that stormy evening in the line shack so many years ago. "That day I found you here, I thought I was just being neighborly," he confessed. "I had no idea I was meeting my future." "Sometimes the best things in life happen when we least expect them," Nora replied, resting her head against his shoulder. They stood together, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant colors, surrounded by the wildflowers that had brought them together. The disappointment that had once seemed unbearable had led Nora to a love deeper and truer than she could have imagined, a love as enduring as the mountains on the horizon, and as abundant as the wildflowers that would bloom in their meadow every spring for the rest of their lives.